as Vivian has already mentioned, a very important subject. So the theme is not only important for least developed countries themselves, but also for the international community as a whole. As you know, 12% of the global population live in least developed countries. This is about 880 million people. But least developed countries only account for less than 2% of the global GDP and about 1% of the global international trade. So it's imperative to help least developed countries to reach their development goals in the context of the 2030 agenda. As we know also, has been already mentioned by Dr. Munoz, the COVID-19 has only deteriorated the socio-economic situation in least developed countries, including those who are very close or up to graduation right now. So this is the context in which this request for extension is taking place. Let me just make a few comments about this request. The first one is that if you may recall, the preamble of the TRIPS agreement does say that least developed countries should enjoy maximum flexibility to enable them to create a sound and viable technological base. So the concept of maximum flexibility is very important. Secondly, this extension is a right. So it's not something that is maybe subject to discussion. Least developed countries have the right to an extension. And in particular, it's also important to note that there is no limit, there is no time limit to such an extension. Third comment is about the nature of the extension and what is the premise of the situation of least developed countries under Article 66.1. As we know, Article 66, paragraph 1, is allowing developing countries to keep in this situation of maximum flexibility, as the preamble says, in order to allow them to develop this viable technological base. So you may ask whether this premise is completely strange to developed countries, or you may ask why developed countries actually accepted the premise that says that intellectual property rights may actually become an obstacle for achieving this viable technological base. So is it that developed countries do accept this concept that intellectual property can be an obstacle for development? And this is the fact really. And clearly when currently developed countries were developing themselves, they actually had a very flexible intellectual property regime. So their industrialization, for instance, the case of the United States, the industrialization process in the United States started on the basis of copying and imitation of technologies originally developed in Europe, in particular in the United Kingdom. In the United States, for instance, during most of the 19th century, foreign authors were denied copyright protection. And the underlying concept in that respect was that there was a need to ensure literacy or to increase literacy in the country, and then to allow access to excellent but cheap books. And therefore, there was a denial of copyright protection for foreigners during most of that century. So there is nothing extraordinary, there is nothing new in the concept that in order to reach a certain level of technological development, there is a need to suspend or not to apply strong intellectual property rights. In fact, I would like to quote one paragraph of one report that was prepared by an advisory board of the US Congress. That was the Office of Technology Assessment. In one report, this body said, and I quote, "When the United States was still a relatively young and developing country, it refused to respect international intellectual property rights on the grounds that it was freely entitled to foreign works to further its social and economic development." So this is what the United States did when the United States itself was developing. And this is, of course, applies to other developed countries that introduce stronger intellectual property protection as they develop, and not from the very beginning of their developing process, in particular industrialization process. And then my fourth and last comment relates to some particular innovative feature of this request, the last request for extension of the transition period for least developed countries. One innovative feature is that unlike previous requests or previous extensions, there is now a proposal not to have an arbitrary and fixed term that would apply to all least developed countries. It is not reasonable to think that all least developed countries will reach a viable technological base at the same time and based on a purely arbitrary term. So that's an important concept. And secondly, the concept that this transition should extend beyond the graduation date. As we know, the graduation date is determined under indicators that do not take into account the technological level that a country may reach. And therefore, it's important to allow for least developed countries that this transition period could go beyond the graduation date. So I hope that you have a fruitful discussion. I reiterate the support of the South Center to the LDCs group in order to achieve, as an outcome, the approval of the extension. Let me just only recall that the South Center has available at the website an important paper produced by our colleague Nirmalya Syam. This is the policy brief number 88, published in March, so a very short time ago, the title of which is Need for Extension of the LDC Transition Period under Article 661 of the TRIPS Agreement until graduation and beyond. So in this paper, you also find foundations for this request. So again, thank you very much for your participation, in particular for the speakers, and I hope you have a very productive discussion. Thank you, Giovanni.
Thank you very much, Professor Correa. I'd like now to give the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Ahmed Makaila, who is the permanent representative of the Republic of Chad to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. And he is currently the coordinator of the Least Developed Countries Group in the World Trade Organization. Ambassador Makaila has previously served as spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, African Integration, International Cooperation, and the Diaspora of Chad. In 2017, he served as Deputy Chief of the Public Information Office and spokesperson of the United Nations Stabilization Mission in Chad. From 1999 to 2016, Ambassador Makaila was a journalist, political analyst, and editorialist, and he has served as the director of the Agence Chadienne de Presse in 2010 and 2011, and as the Deputy Director General of the Office National des Radio-Télévisions de Chad from March 2011 to October 2016. Ambassador Malaika has a degree in journalism, specializing in television from the Institut de Formation Technique de l'Information et de la Communication in Niger, and a master's in law, economy, and management, specializing in management from the Université de l'Île-de-France. And of course, then as the representative of the Least Developed Countries Group for the WTO, Ambassador Makaila is also responsible for the submission of the request for a transition period that was submitted in October 2020. Ambassadeur, merci beaucoup d'être ici avec nous et je vous passe la parole.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la modératrice, pour cette introduction. Je voudrais commencer par saluer tous les participants, saluer notre ami le directeur Carlos du Centre Sud et l'ensemble des participants à ces webinaires. Comme vous l'avez mentionné, ma communication est faite ès-qualité et donc au titre donc de coordonnateur du groupe de PMA à l'OMC. Au nom donc du groupe de PMA, je voudrais remercier le Centre Sud d'avoir organisé ce webinaire et de nous avoir donné l'opportunité de présenter notre communication qui porte la cote IP/C/W 668 soumise au Conseil des ADPIC et qui vise à prolonger la période de transition pour les PMA au titre de l'article 66.1 de l'accord sur les ADPIC. La communication a été déposée et discutée au Conseil des ADPIC en octobre 2020. puis un suivi a eu lieu en mars 2021. Nous avons reçu un grand soutien de la part des membres à ce sujet et je dois les remercier. Certains ont demandé un débat plus approfondi sur la modalité et la durée de la proposition d'extension, ce qui se comprend et se conçoit aisément. Par ailleurs, lors des réunions informelles du groupe et des réunions bilatérales avec le Conseil des ADPIC, le groupe des PMA a répondu à toutes les questions soulevées par les pays développés. Permettez-moi d'entrer davantage en matière sur la raison d'être de cette soumission et de la demande, en plus de ce qui a été très bien mentionné par le directeur Carlos il y a un instant sur la pertinence de cette demande qui, comme il l'a dit lui-même, finalement est en droit pour nous. Dans le cadre de l'article 66.1, il est reconnu que les PMA font face à des contraintes particulières sur le plan économique, mais aussi sur le plan financier, mais également sur le plan administratif. De ce fait, il est reconnu qu'ils ne peuvent pas appliquer certaines dispositions de l'accord de la même manière que d'autres pays membres plus avancés. Il est reconnu que les paiements ont besoin de flexibilité, ça a été dit également, pour pouvoir se doter d'une base technologique viable et relever les défis liés au développement, d'où l'exemption d'appliquer les dispositions de l'accord pour le paiement durant une période initiale de 10 ans renouvelable, sauf bien entendu pour les articles 3, 4 et 5 de l'accord. Le fait est qu'il est difficile d'évaluer quand est-ce que les PMA seront suffisamment matures pour surmonter leurs contraintes économiques, financières et administratives, ce qui signifie que la flexibilité est nécessaire tant qu'une importante incertitude demeure et tant que les PMA ne sont pas en mesure de créer une base technologique viable. En d'autres termes, le maximum d'espace politique possible de flexibilité sont nécessaires pour relever les défis liés au développement. En conséquence, la période de transition initialement accordée devrait rester en vigueur tant qu'un pays est considéré comme PMA. Dans le contexte actuel, la pandémie de la COVID-19 a davantage exacerbé les défis auxquels les PMA font face, sans compter que les effets négatifs de la crise ne sont pas encore pleinement mesurés. Un certain nombre de rapports et d'études analytiques avertissent que la crise aura pour conséquence d'annuler des années de progrès laborieux effectués par les PMA dans les domaines tels que la réduction de la pauvreté, la nutrition, mais aussi l'éducation. En outre, le rapport 2020 de la CNUSED sur le PMA indique que la pandémie a enregistré en 2020 la pire performance économique pour les PMA, et cela depuis 30 ans, avec un niveau de revenus en baisse, des pertes d'emplois généralisées et un creusement des déficits budgétaires. Dans l'ensemble, l'avenir est incertain pour les PMA, y compris pour ceux qui sont en cours de reclassement. Il est donc important de rappeler que l'exclusion d'un pays de la catégorie des PMA est décidée par l'ONU et non par l'OMC. Dans ses résolutions 59/209 de 2004 et 67/221 de 2012, l'Assemblée générale des Nations unies a appelé les membres de l'OMC à autoriser les paiements reclassés à bénéficier du traitement spécial et différencié existant et les exemptions pendant quelques années supplémentaires afin de soutenir un reclassement harmonieux et durable. J'ajoute que dans plusieurs rapports récents portant sur les évaluations d'impact et les profils de vulnérabilité des paiements en voie de reclassement, les organes compétents des Nations Unies ont vivement recommandé la prolongation des mesures spéciales de soutien existantes, même après le reclassement. Par ailleurs, les critères de reclassement des paiements ne sont pas spécifiquement fondés sur le fait qu'ils surmontent leurs contraintes économiques, financières et administratives, ou sur le fait d'une absence de base technologique solide et viable. Ainsi, même après leur reclassement, les paiements vont continuer d'avoir besoin d'une période de transition supplémentaire et à ce titre, le groupe de paiement a donc proposé une période de 12 mois, 12 ans plutôt. Dans une perspective plus large, nous devons garder à l'esprit que les paiements représentent environ 13,4%, comme l'a rappelé il y a un instant le directeur du Centre-Sud, donc 13,4% de la population mondiale, mais ne représentent qu'environ 1,3% du PIB mondial et près de 1% du commerce mondial. Ces chiffres sont sans équivoque. Par conséquent, l'extension de la période de transition au pays de cette catégorie, de même que les 12 années supplémentaires que nous demandons après la sortie de la catégorie, ne serait pas préjudiciable à la communauté mondiale. Au contraire, une telle extension profiterait grandement aux paiements et en mettant sur la voie du développement durable. Les paiements ne demandent pas un privilège, mais souhaitent simplement le maintien de la flexibilité qui leur est déjà accordée, cela durant quelques années supplémentaires, de manière à ce qu'ils puissent mener une transition dans des conditions favorables. Dans le contexte de l'OMC, il faut également indiquer que les paiements possèdent de petites délégations à Genève et qu'il est difficile de négocier une prolongation de la transition après chaque durée, à la fin de chaque durée donc, quand la durée est fixe, compte tenu de leur capacité limitée. Par conséquent, la période de transition plus longue proposée sera utile pour le groupe. Une telle décision sur le maintien des mesures de soutien en faveur des pays reclassés enverrait également un signal fort en faveur de ce groupe et de l'ensemble du système commercial multilatéral. Pour conclure, la communication du groupe des paiements est dûment motivée et demande une nouvelle prolongation de la période de transition prévue à l'article 66.1 de l'accord sur les APIC. La transition existante au titre de l'article 66.1 permet une exemption pour le paiement des dispositions de l'accord à l'exception des articles 3, 4 et 5. Le Conseil des APIC a déjà prolongé cette transition générale à 2 reprises. Et la dernière, donc, prendra fin, comme l'a rappelé la modératrice, le 1er juillet 2021. Contrairement à la durée déterminée accordée précédemment, les paiements demandent désormais donc une prolongation tant qu'un pays reste dans la catégorie des paiements, puis le maintien des flexibilités durant une période de 12 ans après la sortie de la catégorie. Enfin, rien dans l'article 66.1 de l'accord sur les APIC ne limite la portée de la demande que peuvent présenter les paiements. Voilà ce que je souhaitais dire comme contribution à ces webinaires et je vous remercie infiniment pour m'avoir entendu.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Makaila. And so you have introduced us now very eloquently to the proposal and what it contains, and also the clear justification of why it is needed. Now, I'd like to give the floor to Professor Kevin Gallagher, who is the director of the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. He serves on the United Nations Committee on Development Policy and the Think 20 Task Force on International Finance at the G20. So Professor Gallagher, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here with friends from the South Center, the Ambassador, and beyond. I'll make 4 quick points. Obviously, and I just want to say from the outset that I am in strong support of the LDC request for an exemption and for extending the transition period for graduating countries as well. Considering the pandemic shock and the inadequate response thus far from the global community, many LDCs are facing a potential lost decade, and this would only ensure, if they don't get these extensions, being held further back. Graduation doesn't mean that these countries suddenly have skilled labor, productive capacities, or other capacities to benefit from TRIPS, and it certainly doesn't correlate to any evidence basis for such readiness. The fact that once an LDC graduates, they also continue to face huge barriers. At the end of the day, they'll continue to face the same challenges as prior to graduation, so we need to grant this extension into post-graduation as well. I want to start by just echoing a paragraph from the proposal from Chad on behalf of all the LDCs, where they quote the United Nations Secretary General, who observes that, quote, "The least developed country group as a whole, which comprises upwards of 13% of the world's population, has not succeeded in combating poverty through high rates of economic growth, achieving structural transformation, and building productive capacity, nor through increasing its global share of exports. The high degree of vulnerability from which the least developing countries suffer, both to economic and climate shocks, has caused significant setbacks to progress towards sustainable development and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Declining commodity prices have diminished the value of exports and foreign currency earnings, exacerbated debt burdens, while natural hazards, especially climate-related phenomena such as hurricanes, cyclones, flooding, drought, and landslides, have caused devastating loss and damage to lives, livelihoods, and infrastructure." At the CDP, we note that LDCs are highly vulnerable to external shocks such as this one. The Secretariat calculates something called the Economic and Environmental Vulnerability Index when we're evaluating graduation and monitoring progress of LDCs. And we find that LDCs are 30% more vulnerable to droughts, hurricane, floods, pandemics like this one, and capital flow volatility. The key to economic development is the development of knowledge-based assets. That is the most important part of moving up the ladder to get catch-up growth. And LDCs, by definition, lack knowledge-based assets that are so important to build moving forward. 43 of the 47 LDCs saw a fall in their average income, according to our research last year. And the majority of them are at risk or already in debt distress. And they're paying more in external debt service right now than their entire annual health budget in many cases, let alone investing in productive capacity, technological capabilities, and so forth that would allow them to graduate and to take advantage of TRIPS. We also estimate that extreme poverty in LDCs will increase by approximately 35% due to this crisis. The production base of LDCs to try to build knowledge-based assets is still fledgling and needs a lot of attention. Most LDCs are based on one or two extractive industries. And as we've noted, the commodity prices are highly volatile in general and have not been high in this crisis period as they were in the financial crisis of 2008. Given that most LDCs are net technology importers, This particular crisis with debt distress and low commodity prices makes it difficult to import any technologies, which underscores the need to be able to build endogenous productive capacity within the countries themselves. LDCs lack that basis right now, with only about 20% of their populations having the necessary skills to even start, and only about 8% of their manufacturing in medium or high technology areas, relative to 44.9% of emerging market and developing countries. LDCs on average have only about 71 researchers per million inhabitants versus 1,200 for the rest of the world. LDCs only have about 28% of the population in secondary education versus 80% for the rest of emerging market countries and almost 100% for OECD. In LDCs, only about 18% of the people are internet users versus 50% for the rest of emerging market and developing economies and 87% for OECD countries. And one indicator that we always really look at is R&D spending, which for LDCs is far less than 1%, around 0.5%. The rest of the world is 2%, and really frontier economies like South Korea and China are upwards towards 4%. Now, technical assistance under the TRIPS agreement has not, for LDCs, has not been to help build productive capacities so that countries, when they graduate, can take advantage of TRIPS. In fact, the technical assistance has only been to help countries understand the rules and make sure that they can adhere to the rules when they do graduate. Secondly, the support measures are also not there so that countries can build those endogenous capacities, build those technical capacities so they graduate. These two things need to be fundamentally reformed. So there needs to be an expansion of support measures for LDCs that is new financing that helps to build technological capacity, build secondary education, build new industries, endogenous industries and technological capabilities and productive capacities in developing countries. If you look at the financing schemes for IDA and for the World Bank and many other MDBs, they're focusing on important but small micro interventions into health and education, which again are very important, but we need a stepwise increase in development finance for LDCs that helps countries build national innovation systems that can help enhance productive capacity and technological innovation. Without that, technological progress will even be stunted even more, given the global crisis. At DESA, the DESA Secretariat that supports the CDP, of which I'm a member of, in a policy brief that they put out earlier this year, we said COVID-19 threatens to have a devastating consequence on the LDCs. Health systems may be unable to cope with the increase in infections and lockdowns around the world. And we say, unless bold policy actions are taken by the international community, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by the 2030 deadline will likely slip out of reach. As I close, I want to go back to something that Professor Correa noted about, I'm from the United States, and about the record of our own country on this. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm talking to you from Boston, Massachusetts today. And Francis Cabot Lowell in 1812 was a Boston merchant who was importing lots of cotton from the new power looms in the United Kingdom. And he went to the United Kingdom and asked his clients if he could take a tour of the power loom buildings. And he did, and he had a photographic memory, and he memorized the designs of the power loom. And when he came back, we copied the power loom designs, built massive industrial plants in Boston and further up the road in Lowell, and that started the Industrial Revolution in the United States. TRIPS at this point, so that basically the United States industrialization is a function of of the United States going into another country and copying and stealing technological know-how. Now we're in a different world now. TRIPS shouldn't allow other countries to steal like the US did, but they should allow other countries to learn, which is what can happen if we extend this transition period and not just kick the can down the road, but make stepwise investments in national innovation systems and improving the technological and production capacities of least developed countries. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Professor Gallagher. And I think you put us quite well into looking at the development dimension of what for some might seem as a very legal or technical discussion about an exemption about the TRIPS agreement. So I think you've very clearly pointed that LDCs have high vulnerability, not just during their LDC status, but even upon graduation. These issues about how to create productive capacities and technological capabilities will continue. And there's really a need to give greater attention to broadening the support measures that are necessary. And of course, this exemption would just be one small part of that, but a very necessary one. So with that, I'd like to now give the floor to Dr. Giovanni Valencini, who is an economic affairs officer at the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, where he contributed to the UNCTAD's flagship report, including on Africa and on least developed countries. He's a development economist with more than 20 years of experience in research and policy analysis. And in his current role, he's worked also on trade negotiations at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa and various other assignments. He has published also widely articles and chapters on international trade, sustainable development, and industrialization and development finance, and he is a PhD in economics. So Giovanni, very much looking forward to hearing from you also on the analysis and on the report that has already been mentioned by others. So to you, Giovanni, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, professors, all protocols observed. Let me start by thanking the South Center for inviting us to this interesting and very timely and important discussion. I'll be sharing my presentation right now to delve a little bit deeper on the impact of the COVID-19 shock in the least developed countries. So I think, as has been said already, this is a crisis that is unlike any other in history. And in the case of LDCs, even though the recorded health impact has so far been relatively limited, in socioeconomic terms, it has had already, and it is having already, a huge impact. It's a crisis that is peculiar because it's hitting simultaneously supply and demand in different points of the economy, whether it is at household level, at enterprise level, in the domestic or international sphere. And on top of that, there are also feedback loops between the policy responses that are adopted to try to contain the pandemic and the socioeconomic impact that is resulting from that. If we look at the estimates that have come out lately, both from UNCTAD a couple of weeks ago and most recently from the IMF, what we see is that this is the largest global recession since World War II. According to the latest IMF in 2020, the global output declined by 3.5%, and these will be followed by a rebound in 2021. UNCTAD had similar estimates. In the case of LDCs, however, as was noted earlier by Professor Gallagher, this decline in real GDP has implied not only a recession, but really a decline in GDP per capita in the overwhelming majority of LDCs. If you look at the graph below, where we contrast the GDP per capita growth in the pre-crisis on the horizontal axis and in the post-crisis 2020 and 2021, it's quite clear that only a handful of LDCs have been able to maintain a positive growth in GDP per capita, and nearly all of them have been suffering a growth deceleration, when not a decline in GDP per capita, as I said. Equally, what we've noticed is that in not only in 2020, but also in 2021, these will be the first 2 consecutive years during which no LDC will meet the 7% growth target since its very adoption. So this is a very important setback. And the most affected countries, if you look at the nature of the shock, are of course SIDS and tourist dependent countries that are affected by travel ban, but also commodity exporters, especially fuels exporters that were affected by a declining global demand and a falling price, as well as countries that were heavily integrated in global value chains, notably in the apparel industry, because disruptions there, coupled with the coping mechanism of lead firms, which often cancel entire orders without necessarily paying or indemnizing the subcontractors, have created huge disruptions along the value chain. If we look at the latest assessment, what we also see in terms of trade is that we are actually witnessing a divergent rebound in global trade. UNCTAD has estimated recently that essentially goods trade rebounded in the second half of 2020, but services trade has lagged behind and continues to be far below pre-crisis level. And all of that, the interplay of these two factors amounts to basically a 9% decline in global trade on a yearly basis. Moreover, the rebound has been essentially pulled by East African and the Pacific region, whereas other regions continue to witness a lower trade, both in goods and in services. And even more so, in the case of most developing countries, we still see a compression in import, which could have knock-on effect on the domestic economy, because we know, especially in the case of least developed countries, they're import dependent for a whole range of sensitive products, from food to drugs and medicine and pharmaceutical products, as well as capital goods. In terms of financial flow, what we've estimated at UNCTAD is also the decline in export will be exacerbated by a decline in basically all forms of financial flows. FDI contracted globally by 40% in 2020, and this is expected to rebound only by 2022. So this will not be a V-shaped recovery in FDI flows, but rather a U-shape or perhaps even L-shaped recovery. Remittances also have been projected to fall by 7% in 2020, and the World Bank does not expect them to rebound in 2021 either, but rather be further witnessed in a further decline. There's a lot of uncertainty on ODA flows, but recent preliminary evidence suggests that there will be a contraction there as well. And as Professor Gallagher said, in the case of several LDCs, we also witness capital flight and exchange rate depreciation, which end up increasing the cost of debt servicing, particularly for many of the LDCs that are displaying worsening debt vulnerabilities. This is not to say that LDCs have not adopted policy responses. On the contrary, they acted fairly rapidly, I would say, with a whole range of policy responses, from fiscal ones like public work schemes or tax deferral, to monetary one like credit support or reduction in banking reserve requirements, cash transfers, notably through digital means, as well as trade measures like trade facilitation measures or exemptions for tariff. However, there are entrenched inequalities in the capacity to respond to the crisis, and precisely the terms of LDC's integration into the global economy undermine their capacity to respond. First and foremost, most of the LDCs were running structural deficits, both in their government budget as well as in the current account budget. And that explains partly why the fiscal space was very reduced, And so what you see in the two graphs is a comparison of the response policies, both fiscal and in terms of liquidity support of LDCs compared to other developing and even more so other developed nations. What you see here is basically in the top panel, already as a percentage of GDP, the response policies enacted by LDCs are far smaller than in those enacted in developed nations. And if you look at it in terms of dollar per capita, this divide becomes really extreme. We are talking about response policies in the order of $20, $30 per person in LDC compared to more than 1,300 or 2,100 in the case of developed countries. And these resulted already in an increase in people living in extreme poverty by 32 million people in LDCs. And so there are huge economic costs. I think what's also important to highlight in this context is that in terms of outlook, even if the most recent estimates have suggested that the outlook is better than previous forecasts, we're still talking about a medium-term damage and possibly long-term effect on potential output. This is due to the fact that the crisis has led to sluggish investment, which will affect, of course, output growth in the future due to heightened uncertainty and precautionary saving behavior. Moreover, there are huge disruptions in terms of human capital accumulation. Recently, UNICEF put out a report that was saying globally there are 800 million students whose schooling has been disrupted. And that, of course, will affect not only potential output, but also the possibility to develop this endogenous technological base that we were talking about before. On top of that, the crisis has led to huge destruction in terms of employment, particularly in contexts like LDCs, where firms are often informal. Access to credit market is not particularly easy, to use an euphemism, and therefore a prolonged crisis might lead to a loss in terms of productive capabilities, which takes a toll on future growth as well. Still to be assessed are also long-term shifts in terms of industrial competitiveness and consumption habits. For example, the extent to which transport industry will recover its pre-crisis levels remains questioned. And that because obviously in terms of business services and related travel, there are huge uncertainties on the extent to which they will recover to the pre-crisis level. If we look at the IMF forecast, for example, we've seen that the number of years LDCs might take to recover the pre-COVID-19 level in GDP per capita suggests that this is a medium-term, if not a long-term problem. The median LDC will take more than 3 years to recover the level of GDP per capita that it had in 2019. And for 10 LDCs, this level won't be recovered not even in 2026, which is the final horizon of the IMF forecast. Now, the question is then, are we building back better? The kind of shocks that we're witnessing are not only due to COVID, but there's a recession. And on top of it, there are likely effects in terms of climate change, as were highlighted before in the context of the economic and environmental vulnerability index. So in terms of lessons from the crisis, I think one was already eloquently put forth by Professor Gallagher. Productive capacities are key for resilience. We've noted, for example, in last year's least developed country report, more sophisticated firms that tended to be more productive, better integrated in the market, showed greater resilience and adaptive capacities. For example, several firms in the textile sector were able to repurpose and start producing personal protective equipment. Or firms with digital capabilities were able to shift more rapidly to e-commerce channels and so on. And that highlights the importance of having an endogenous innovation ecosystem and endogenous capability basis. Secondly, long-term development finance is critical to this process of accumulating technological capabilities. And that is why at UNTITLed, we've advocated for a Marshall Plan. We've advocated for redistributive SDR allocations. We've advocated for a more generous climate finance window for least developed countries that will be at the forefront of the climate change impact, as well as for a proper mechanism for debt workout. Perhaps more specifically related to the TRIPS debate, we've also highlighted how policy space and international support measures are vital to support the efforts of the LDCs in developing technological capabilities. The kind of engagements country can have in advanced technologies, and we know we're on the verge of a digital revolution, or what here in Switzerland is often called the fourth industrial revolution. The engagement in these technologies is contingent on the presence of adequate basis in terms of manufacturing capabilities, but also complementary skills. Without this, we're running the risk of witnessing a widening digital divide. And that is why policy space is of vital importance in this respect. Finally, a note on this issue of graduation and technological capabilities. I think I fully support what Professor Gallagher said, that the challenges in catching up in terms of technologies do not end with LDC graduation. Graduation is barely a milestone, but many of the development challenges countries are confronted with will continue even beyond graduation. And there's a very interesting example in terms of the extent to which Bangladesh was capable of developing a viable pharmaceutical sector up to now, precisely leveraging on some of the flexibilities that are allowed by TRIPS. And finally, and with this I would close, I think the crisis highlighted the need for more systemic thinking. The repercussions of the COVID-19 shock show that crisis can quickly cascade from a health dimension to an environmental one to a socioeconomic one. And this is just one example of this pattern of systemic interdependence. Moreover, there's a complex pattern of interdependence worldwide in terms of linkages through supply chain, through value chains, and so on, which require a systemic thinking in terms of adopting adequate multilateral cooperation frameworks to respond to this situation. And with this, I give you back the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Valencini. And just to let our participants know that we will have space for questions to be posed. You can either already start posing them in the Q&A section you see on the bottom right side of your screen. Otherwise, you may just keep those to be then inserted once we start that segment. So Dr. Valencini has already presented to us a lot of details about what is not just the economic situation, but overall, what's the prospects for LDCs. And in that sense, why the TRIPS extension also fits well within that sort of enabling framework that the global community also should assist in terms of assisting LDCs in making that transition to build back better as is needed, and that the current situation is really making that objective a lot more difficult. And not just in terms of GDP, as was mentioned by several of the presenters already, even when we see economic growth that has not necessarily linked to poverty reduction or significant people's lives improvements. And that's really important also to link up when we're discussing this issue, not just from the the trade and economic growth area, but more broadly that this is linked to development, and that way we need to see that much more broadly. So I would like now to introduce Dr. Joy Categor, who's a leading expert on international trade, investment, and development issues. She's currently Senior Strategy Advisor in Africa at the United Nations Development Program, New York, and she has shaped the United Nations Development Program support program to the African Continental Free Trade Area and its futures report called Making the AFCFTA Work for Women and Youth. She was the founding head of the UNCTAD Regional Office for Africa in Addis Ababa, where she spent close to 5 years directing oversight strategy and capacity building teams that supported the African Union and the regional economic communities in designing the AFCFTA. She's also former WTO Secretariat official, where she managed relations with the African groups and was responsible for negotiations on special and differential treatment. She was also a WTO negotiator for the government of Uganda. And thereafter, she was also at South Center, where we were very proud to call her our colleague. And she led there the work on services. She has also been associated to Oxfam International in Geneva. She's a member of the World Economic Forum Global Forum Council on Trade and Investment. And she also sits on the board of the advisory board of the African Journal on International Economic Law. So Joy, pleasure to have you with us, and you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viviana. What a pleasure to see you after such a long time, and to see colleagues like Giovanni as well. Professor Correa, it is a pleasure to be back in an audience that is facilitated by the South Center, a place I will always call home, because in a previous life, I used to be one of the staff members there. Excellence, Ambassador Makaila, thank you very much also for gracing this occasion. So distinguished panelists, participants, 15 years ago, I used to be in the LDC group. I used to be focal point of the LDC group on TRIPS. And at that time, we were sitting at a negotiation table, perhaps similar to the one Ambassador Makaila is sitting on right now, tussling out the duly motivated request and making the case for the fast extension of the TRIPS agreement. This duly motivated request was not an easy one, because there was always a desire to go into the heart of 66.1 and talk to an LDC as opposed to the group. There was always a desire to push the line that there is no automaticity. There was always a desire to say that S&D is not about exclusion from the commitments. It's about giving you space and time to get ready with the ultimate mind frame to walk into implementation of the rights and the obligations. And so in a sense, looking back 15 years later, I come to this conversation with that layer of experience, thinking about what would I do if I were sitting at that table? And I'd like to make 3 points. One is that there is the question about whether LDCs deserve an extension, for me, is moot, not least because of all of the points that have been made by Professor Gallagher, by Ambassador Makaila, by Giovanni, by Professor Carlos Correa, and others. The question is, how do we posit the argumentation within a wholesome interpretation of what WTO law is supposed to be? And so I'd like to make a case that when we look at 66.1 in exclusion, we miss the point, because we should look at 66.1 together with 66.2, together with Article 18 of the GATT. Then you come with a whole development frame of what participation for least developed countries should be in the multilateral trading system. The second point I'd like to make is time enough? What if you got another 10 years? Shall we be again in a space of extending extensions? And the third point I'd like to make then is, why is it particularly important to have this conversation right now in the context of an AFCFTA dispensation in Africa, a place which, as you know, most of the LDCs are from, 33 from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa. So if we go to the question of the confluence between an extension, technology transfer, and the right the right to establish industries, I think that puts an interesting layer to the conversation. Because you see, 66.1 is a recognition of precisely what 50 years ago the United Nations system agreed, that there's a group of countries that have specific, unique challenges that require special attention. 50 years later, you still have 47 of LDCs, 33 of which are in sub-Saharan Africa. So the question of whether LDCs need special attention, in my mind, is perhaps not where we should be. We should be asking ourselves a different question, which is, now that we have this LDC group, what is the role of intellectual property in meeting the broader framework of development as encapsulated by WTO law? If you take that argumentation, you necessarily move away from 66.1 and start to ask the question, what has 66.2 done to help LDCs to get that viable technological base? Because remember, 66.2 is very clear about the need, in S&D, and this, this used to be my life before. In S&D, we always talk about shall and should. And in 66.2, you have clarity that developed countries shall incentivize, enterprises and institutions to provide technology. Technology is critical because technology, at the heart of technology, are the ideas that Professor Gallagher was talking about. So how can we do more on 66.2 to ensure that even when we reach graduation, we're not really talking about a question of extension, so to speak, because you've lifted both sides of the equation, because you've had an extension, but you've not just had an extension where you let the obligations go. You've had an extension where there is sufficient goodwill and demonstration of building of capacities on the technological side to help less developed countries to build that viable technological base. And when you look at this all in the frame of Article 18, it gets even stronger. Because remember, Article 18 is one of the first inclusions in GATT law, 19, I think 49 that the article was added to the rule book. Article 18, the infant industry clause of WTO law. It's critical because it tells you that there has always been a recognition that countries can indeed put aside certain obligations of WTO law in general for the purpose of building an industry, for the purpose of establishing infant industries, for the purpose of ensuring that trade works for development. So I would say that in the argumentation, it's important to put the frame like that 66.1 is strong, but it's not as strong as a confluence of what have the others done to help us to meet what was established in the time frame. And number two, let's go back to the broad frame, that this is actually about recognizing that industrialization is critical, because once you have the industrialization, you have the goods you're producing and therefore can increase your export profile. So if that is one set of arguments, the second one is time enough? So as I said, I started out in my career negotiating trade agreements at the WTO. And we got lots of S&D, lots of extensions. In my time, I think the first extension we got 7.5 years. Here we are, 15 years later, saying, how do we get more? And this time, let's stretch it longer. Valid, valuable, but not enough. We must ask a second question, which is, what if we get that time? What more can be done to answer that question of boosting productive capacities for trade? And what of that equation is within the hands of WTO members? And there I'd like to make some ideas. That one, we have to think about, even if ODA is under threat, we have to think about what's left of that ODA to say, how can it be used productively to target the strengthening of capacities on the technological side? We have to ask ourselves the question, how do we use investment policy to ensure that companies come and set up brick and mortar in LDCs and by necessary implication are bringing with them their technology? We have to ask another question, how do we use public sector financing to invest in creating these capacities? And then a fourth question that's perhaps outside of the 66.2 is, where are Africa's actual inputs coming from of a technological nature? The world has shifted in terms of the relations of Africa with other countries. There's a lot of technology being brought in from South-South partners. And therefore, we want to ask ourselves, if we're going in the direction of the commercial terms, because the pushback we always got in the negotiations was, well, it must be on a commercial basis. Can we source differently on that commercial basis? The third and last point I'd like to make is, why is all of this important in the AFCFTA dispensation? Because you see, the way in which Africa is integrated into the multilateral trading system and the global economy is that you have your spot, it's guaranteed, it's firm, but it's to send us the raw materials. And yet when you look into the African, intra-African space, you start to see a different picture. You start to see more value addition, you start to see more diversified exports, and critically important for this conversation, you start to see, I think UNCTAD has measured these numbers, 20% more technological content in intra-African trade. So while Africa's 82% of trade with the rest of the world is still at that low value, low volume of export of commodities, in Africa, we're seeing a different dispensation, which is that the 18% is telling us that with the right technology, Africa can expand, create this inclusive arrangement where trade can boost development. And so I'd like to make the case that there is an important interlinkage in the AFCFTA's success with ensuring that the extension actually succeeds. And so to conclude, for me, the question of whether LDCs should get their request extended for the duration that they're LDCs is moot. It's obvious it has to be done. The argumentations have to be strengthened to talk not only about the legal instrument that gets us there, but the requirements and the complementarity expected of other members to boost that capacity and go back to the foundationals. To then say, time is not the only solution. We must look at complementary measures and use all the tools in the box to get us there. And finally, to say, it is of critical importance, mission critical, that the extension goes ahead because the AFCFTA, in a sense, relies on it. The COVID point, in a sense, for me, is a bit tricky because if we were to have this conversation in 2019, pre-COVID, the reasons would still be cogent. And therefore, in my mind, we have to really get this big basket of tough points that situate this in its right development context, which is that 50 years after creating the LDC category, we're still struggling with a disproportionately high level of numbers in Africa. Trade has a role to play in changing that, but it is not by taking away the flexibilities, it's by making them work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dr. Categor for those insightful additional points, in particular of arguments more broadly that need to be made with linkages, not only pertaining to the rationale for Article 66.1, which is the basis for the extension, but really all the other associated articles within the TRIPS agreement, in particular on enabling technology transfer to take place specifically for least developed countries, which is an obligation by developed countries that shall provide incentives to their private enterprises for technology transfer to LDCs. On that point, there's been many communications from the LDC group noting that there needs to be more targeted incentives and more examples to show that this is taking place by the developed country partners. So there's clearly a gap there that would be very helpful to building those productive capacities in technological base. And also there was the linkage to the more broad framework of the WTO agreement and its purpose, and how trade must serve all members. And in the case of LDCs in particular, TRIPS should not become a constraint, but actually it should be assisting countries in building that technological base. So how to do that is really up to developing countries and LDCs as part of that, as a particular interest in ensuring that they can develop their intellectual property system in line with their development context and their objectives, as other countries in the past have done historically, as we also heard. Now, with that, I'd like to give the floor to our last speaker. And after that, we will open for the Q&As for any questions that we might have for participants, and then hear some final words from our speakers. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Nirmalya Syam, who's a senior program officer at the South Center. He's also dealt with us at the South Center on the issue of the LDC extension for the past periods, past years, and also has authored, as was mentioned, a recent policy brief on the analysis. So happy also to present to you some of this detailed research. So Nirmalya, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Viviana. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists and all colleagues who have also joined us for this important briefing. I would start by echoing the urgency that was expressed at the outset by Viviana of ensuring that this duly motivated request that has been submitted by LDCs as late as October last year is pursued in terms of actual decision, actual negotiations or discussions on the terms of the decision, going beyond rhetorical expressions of general support that we hear in the plenary sessions of the TRIPS Council, and ensure that the extension as requested is granted as we come near the end of this transition period, that is before the 1st of July. In my presentation, will focus basically on the legal feasibility of the legal scope of what is allowed within the terms of the TRIPS agreement, as well as related rules in the WTO agreement, on which the request by the LDCs is anchored. Many thanks to the speakers before me who have eloquently shown why there is a need for an extension of this transition period until graduation and beyond, noting the fact that as has been mentioned in the past, even in at least in 2 UN General Assembly resolutions and in several reports by UNCTAD and UN DESA, for example, that LDC graduation is merely the achievement of important statistical milestones, but that doesn't mean that the vulnerabilities, the development challenges that they face disappear just because certain criteria have been achieved. And therefore, in order to ensure that graduation is sustainable, it is important that extended international support measures such as the TRIPS extension is granted. So let me start with the text of Article 66 of the TRIPS Agreement. And this is a quote from Article 66.1. And I would emphasize on the following aspects. 66.1 is based on 3 contextual rationale. One, in view of the special needs and requirements of the least developed country members, which are not defined in the TRIPS agreement. So this is up to the LDCs to establish those special needs and requirements through their duly motivated request, as they have in this request, for example. Their economic, financial, and administrative constraints. And thirdly, their need for flexibility to create a sound and viable technological base. So there are 3 elements that are present in Article 66.1. And each of those 3 elements have significant weight in determining whether the LDCs would actually need an extension of the transition period. And in view of these requirements, the makers of the TRIPS agreement agreed to grant the LDCs an initial period of 10 years, during which they were exempted from implementing the provisions of the TRIPS agreement. This was not a period which was given to them to progressively implement the TRIPS agreement, but this was a period that was made available to them to deny implementation of the TRIPS agreement if they so desired. So that's an important point to note, because sometimes you will hear statements to the fact, particularly from developed country partners, that this period should have been utilized to make progressive moves to implement the TRIPS obligations. Second point to note is that this transition period was made extendable. And this is unique in the sense that it was different from other transitional arrangements that exist in the TRIPS agreement, for example, for developing countries and economies and emerging economies. So it said that the Council for TRIPS shall, mandatory language, upon a duly motivated request by LDC members, accord extensions of this period. Now, what this period is has also not been defined, but as we see in terms of the practice of past extensions, this period has been set in varied terms in different extension decisions. So, for example, the first time that an extension was granted was in 2002, which we don't mention much nowadays, but it's an extension that, that was granted for pharmaceutical products, and that was granted till 2016. Sorry, this is very much mentioned. The second one, the 2005 extension for Maldives. This is usually not referred to much, but this was the first time that an LDC actually had sought an extension anticipating its graduation to cover for the period beyond graduation. Subsequently, what happened was that the TRIPS Council granted an extension till the date of graduation in 2007. And thereafter, graduation itself got postponed, and Maldives, for example, got the benefit of the general extension that was granted till 2013 in 2005. The pharmaceutical extension, as we know, was subsequently extended till 2033, and the general transition period that was granted in 2005 was extended in 2013 and is set to expire this year. And in that context, the LDCs have made this present request. Now, we have heard the motivations behind the LDC request, but I would just, to refresh ourselves, go through the text of the proposed extension decision that has been annexed to the duly motivated request submitted by the LDCs. So it calls upon the TRIPS Council to decide that a least developed country member shall not be required to apply the provisions of the agreement other than Articles 3, 4, and 5, as long as that member remains in the category of a least developed country, and thereafter, for a period of 12 years from the date of entry into force of a decision by the UN General Assembly to exclude that member from the least developed country category. It's important to note here that whether a country remains in the LDC category or graduates out of that is not determined by the WTO membership. It is determined by the UN General Assembly, as we've heard, on the basis of recommendations made by the Committee on Development Policy. And those are determined on the basis of certain criteria, which do not necessarily include all the vulnerabilities or all the special needs that the LDCs face, including an assessment of their technological capacity. So the moot question, and this has arisen in the context of the informal discussions and in the statements that have been made in the TRIPS Council, are whether the TRIPS Council can grant an extension until graduation. Sorry, I think I skipped a slide now. So the moot question is whether the TRIPS Council can grant extension until graduation and beyond graduation as well. So the first point to note is that, as I mentioned already, 66.1 does not define what is the period of extension. It says that the Council shall grant extensions of this period, and the period has been differently set in different extension decisions. And therefore, an LDC member may request a period of extension which it thinks is the most suitable in the context of its special needs and requirements and the challenges that it faces, because the LDCs are the best judge of what challenges they face and how long it would require for them to overcome those challenges. And if they are of the view that these challenges would not be overcome as long as they remain LDCs, which they have echoed in the present request, for example, this is a very legitimate and just request to make and legally feasible in terms of Article 66.1. If you look at past practice, there are, as I said, different periods have been set. And in fact, the past decisions have also included extension until graduation, though as a floor and not a ceiling. If graduation were to be achieved by an LDC before the specified date till extensions were set. This request basically seeks to make that ceiling, make that floor a halfway ceiling, if it were, and then on top of it add a 12-year period. Even in 2013, it's worthy of taking note. The LDCs had originally requested for an extension until graduation. It was only when the developed country members insisted on a specific term less than graduation that a period was set. But as we can see, the evidence suggests that that period has not been sufficient. And in the light of that experience also, this request by the LDCs becomes legitimate. It is important to note that an extension until graduation will not be a perpetual extension, but it will be an extension until the achievement of a specific criteria on which LDC graduation is based. Hence, this will be contingent upon certain events occurring, as will be determined by the UNCDP and recommended thereafter by the UN General Assembly, rather than an arbitrarily negotiated specific date, which may not be realistic and would require the LDCs to come back to the same position time and time again, which would be avoided through an extension until graduation. Now, on the question of whether the TRIPS Council can grant an extension beyond graduation, it is important to again note that nothing in Article 66(1) prevents the TRIPS Council from extending the transition period beyond graduation. In fact, past extension decisions have included conditions and language that have added to what was there in 66.1. For example, in 2005, the extension decision included conditions to not roll back existing levels of IP protection, even though the same is not expressed within the terms of Article 66.1. This was watered down in 2013, where this no rollback condition was changed into a hortatory best endeavor commitment on the part of LDCs to endeavor to preserve existing levels of IP protection. It's important to note that that conditions have been added into beyond 66.1 languages, for example, sometimes by the TRIPS Council, without getting into a question of whether the TRIPS Council has the jurisdiction or the authority to do so, because it's the members who can do that. Moreover, it's important to note that under Article 9.2 of the WTO Agreement, while the formal adoption of an interpretation question of a covered multilateral agreement is within the ambit of the General Council or the Ministerial Conference, where that interpretation involves the question of interpreting a provision of one of the annexed multilateral agreements, the relevant council, so in the case of the TRIPS agreement, the TRIPS Council would first have to take a call on it and recommend such an interpretation for formal adoption by the General Council. So the act, therefore, would, or the ministerial. So that act would become a mere formality. So in that sense also, this request by the LDCs is fully legitimate and legally possible that the TRIPS Council can recommend such a decision in terms of an extension. I would stop here. If you have any questions, would be happy to take. But briefly, therefore, to sum up, the conclusions would be that the TRIPS Council has the full authority to grant an extension of the transition period until graduation and beyond, as the LDCs have requested. And there is nothing in the agreement, TRIPS agreement or the WTO agreement, that prevents the grant of such an extension as requested. Thank you.
Thank you, Nirmalya, also for that deep dive into what is specifically in Article 66.1, the legal reading and then interpretation of how it can be implementing according to the duly motivated request that has been made by the LDC group. Now we hope, participants, that has helped all of you to understand both the context as well as the specificities about the LDC request for the extension of the transition period under the TRIPS agreement, Article 66.1. And again, we've tried to highlight that this is an urgent issue that has not been perhaps capturing enough attention currently, but it's very much related to all these related discussions that are very substantial, in particular during the COVID-19 pandemic, but also for the future of a very important and large part of the world.